This is CPX number 11, Catechism of Pope St. Pius X. Today we're going to be talking about the creation of man and woman and the fall of man and woman. The Creed is the first section, and we're actually only in the first sentence. I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Today we're going to continue talking about the creation of man and what it meant when Adam and Eve decided to disobey. Page 1415, we're only looking at questions 35 to 39 right now. Question number 35, in what state did God place our first parents, Adam and Eve? Answer, God placed our first parents, Adam and Eve, in the state of innocence and grace, but they soon fell away by sin. Question 36, besides innocence and sanctifying grace, did God confer any other gifts on our first parents? Answer, besides innocence and sanctifying grace, God conferred on our first parents other gifts, which along with sanctifying grace they were to transmit to their descendants. These were 1, integrity, that is the perfect subjection of sense to reason, 2, immortality, 3, immunity from all pain and sorrow, 4, a knowledge in keeping with their state. Question number 37, what was the nature of Adam's sin? Answer, Adam's sin was a sin of pride and grave disobedience. Question number 38, what chastisement was meted out to the sin of Adam and Eve? Answer, Adam and Eve lost the grace of God and the right they had to heaven. They were driven out of the earthly paradise, subjected to many miseries of soul and body, and condemned to death. Question number 39. If Adam and Eve had not sinned, would they have been exempt from death? Answer, if Adam and Eve had not sinned, and if they had remained faithful to God, they would, after a happy and tranquil sojourn here on earth, and without dying, have been transferred by God into heaven to enjoy a life of unending glory. Thus are the words of the Pope. Now I'm going to give you a few of my own thoughts. As most of you know, Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 is the creation of man and woman. Man and woman lived in what's called original justice. Genesis 3 introduces the fall. Original justice was lost at the fall. One of the aspects of original justice is that our senses were supposed to be subject to our will, and our will was supposed to be subject to our intellect. This gets inverted. The other thing that gets inverted is that all of creation, animals, plants, even some sense of the natural course of things, was subject to man who was made steward by God himself over earth. That's thrown into a wonky state in Genesis chapter 3 also. Now, if you look at all the ancient Near East texts of creation, one thing that I find very fascinating is that the Mesopotamian stories of creation all involve violence. But the true fact, the true account, which is Judaism and Catholicism, is that God overflows in his goodness upon all of creation so that in that light there is not the tiniest shred of darkness. God's overflowing goodness makes it so that there is no death. So think about that. We are in this time when everyone's obsessed with death. Everyone's talking about the death rates of COVID. Everyone's talking about how many people died in this riot or this shooting or whatever else. Everyone today except a few Christians lives in great fear of death. But God never made death to be part of this planet. What changed? Well, Lucifer, who is at one point subject and obedient to God in heaven, out of pride, disobeyed, and St. Michael threw him to the earth. Then man and woman, Adam and Eve, had a choice whether to obey God or Satan, and in Genesis 3, they chose Satan. And not only did they lose their rights to paradise, but we're going to talk about the other things that we just found that get lost there too. They lost the right to heaven. Now, I didn't know that until I had read this Catechism of Pope St. Pius X. As I said before, we all can learn things even from the basics. I thought before this catechism here, I had thought Adam and Eve were going to live forever in paradise without death. But if you listen closely there, Pope St. Pius X said, after a happy and tranquil sojourn here on earth, they would have, without dying, those are those two key words if you remember anything from today's CPX 11. Remember, without dying. We were never meant to die. Have been transferred by God into heaven. So this time on earth would have been a sojourn without so many thorns and temptations and everything else. And ultimately Adam and Eve, and assumedly all their kids, would have been transferred to heaven. But due to the fall, Genesis 3, they lose not only heaven, but in question 38, he tells us the other three things that they lost. Paradise, you can see that in Genesis 3 when they're kicked out. But also, now man and woman are subjected to many miseries of soul and condemned to death. So again, death was a natural or supernatural consequence to the fact that they had disobeyed God. And, in some sense, it's certainly a punishment, but in another sense, it's natural. God is the only source of life in the whole universe. So when you cut yourself off from him, how do you live? You can't. Okay, question number 37. What was the nature of Adam's sin? Adam's sin was a sin of pride and of grave disobedience. I heard an exorcist once say, imagine how offended God would be if only every person on the planet only committed one venial sin today. Think about that. 7 billion venial sins. Imagine the offense that is to God. And I'm pretty sure that most 7 billion people are committing mortal sins, not just venial sins. But think of what one sin of Adam and Eve did. I mean, it unraveled all of creation into a state of disobedience and death. One sin. And that should give us all pause when we think of committing a sin with full knowledge and full consent of the will, that disobedience of one man and one woman led to billions of people living in, what did the Pope just tell us? Miseries of soul. So this shows that even though we can't take this social justice warrior attitude that sin is only communal, there is the fact that one individual sin leads to communal misery. Adam and Eve, one sin, and there's 7 billion people of us now living in as the Pope said, miseries of soul. So this is why we have to be so obedient to God as Christians. Still moving backwards here. Question number 36. Besides innocence and sanctifying grace, did God confer any other gifts on our first parents? Instead of just reading that to you again, I just want you to note that these things will be given back to us in heaven. Again, I have to keep stressing, we get our bodies back in heaven if we're saved, please God. And these things are restored to us. This is another reason we have to be so obedient. These things are restored to us that were originally given to Adam and Eve. 36, integrity, that's a perfect subjection of sense to reason. So just as we were created, that senses were subject to will was subject to intellect, that's going to be restored fully in heaven. But death isn't going to be a magical change. This is why we have to start living mortified lives now, where we don't just give ourselves everything we want, because that begins to put that back in order for us. So mortification is the beginning of redemption. Again, this isn't Pelagianism where we pull ourselves up to heaven by our own bootstraps, but cooperation with salvation has to become where we start to obey our reason instead of our feelings at all times. Number 2, immortality. Most of you know that. Immortality is going to be life eternal. Number 3, this is very beautiful. Immunity from all pain and sorrow. Think about that. Not only will we be souls in heaven, please God, but bodies also. Imagine living in your body free of all pain and sorrow for trillions and trillions and trillions of years. This is the promise that God gives us if we are obedient to the death that God has planned for us. Death to ourselves on earth, and as many of the saints say, obedient to the death that God has planned for us, please God, in sanctifying grace. And then number 4, a knowledge in keeping with their state. Now that's an interesting one that when I read that may have confused a few of you. What did that mean, keeping with their state? It means Adam knew he was husband and father, and Eve knew that she was wife and mother. But isn't this interesting that as everything gets unraveled deeper and deeper, the farther we get from God, the more we lose a knowledge of our state? I mean, think about it. Women want to be priests these days. Men want to be women these days. Parents want to be best friends with their kids. Kids want to rule over their parents. All of those things I just named is totally inverted. Those things don't lend itself to heaven because, again, one of the aspects of original justice in Genesis 1 and 2 is a knowledge in keeping with their state. So again, for redemption to take place, the cooperation with the free gift of grace, which is our salvation, is necessary, including keeping with your state in life. Last thing I'll just say is please say an Our Father for me at the end of all these. I'm going to give you a reminder. And as I ask you for that Our Father, that's also going to be your cue that a blessing is coming. So please say an Our Father for me. Et benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater Filius et Spiritus Sanctus. Amen.